We've all heard it a million times. You have to play the blues. For most of us, this probably leads us to think, all right, well, I got to practice my 12-bar blues. But what if we want to connect some of the ideas, some of the vibe that we have on that classic song form to other standards that we play? Today, we're going to look at some approaches of how you can take this blues feel and apply it to tunes that are not blueses. What's up, everyone? Before we jump into today's lesson, a little bit of shameless promotion. All of you who come to me here on YouTube are probably mostly seeking out sort of jazz trombone or maybe improvisational advice and tips and that sort of thing. But in addition to my work as an educator, I also keep a pretty full schedule as a performer. And on that note, I'm super excited that today my band Paper Canaries is releasing their debut single. The tune is called B.A.C. You can find it on all the different streaming platforms. You can find it on here on YouTube. I'll throw a card up in the corner so you can just follow the link. It sounds a little bit like this. I've dubbed the style of music that we play in this band as prog jazz. We're sort of jazz musicians existing in a progressive rock band. But if you enjoy what I do here and are curious about the other areas that I work as a musician, check the stuff out. We'll have a full release in the fall of 2024 with that project. Paper Canaries, B.A.C., check it out. All right, with that stuff out of the way, let's dig into today's content. So we're talking about the blues. Now, the blues means lots of different things. It has so much to do with your sound, your feel, the way you play inflection, all that sort of stuff. You got to do listening to check that stuff out. We're not necessarily going to delve into that in today's lesson. Instead, we're going to look at a few more of the sort of X's and O's of actually what we play and why we might choose to employ some of these blues ideas. So most of us are probably familiar with just like the regular old blues scale that we might learn as like the first thing we learn as improvisers. A lot of us are probably already familiar with that, but just to make sure we're clear and on the same page, that's the root, the flat third, the 4, the sharp 4, the 5, and the flat 7. Again, that's a very foundational concept for most people working on improvisation. The one that you may be less familiar with, or maybe just less familiar with using, is the so-called major blues scale, sometimes referred to as the Kansas City scale. That scale is made up of the root, the second, the flat third, the major third, the fifth, and the sixth. It's basically a major pentatonic with the addition of a flat third as well, so it has a major third and a flat third. Both of these scales are very useful for us, sort of building our vocabulary and helping us find ideas. We are actually going to start out by focusing on the second one, because that's what's really, I think, going to aid us the most on these tunes that are not 12-bar blueses, but we will talk about the first one as well. So let's dig into just a couple of approaches how we apply these. We are going to look at the Fats Waller tune Honeysuckle Rose as sort of the jumping off point for this week's lesson. We're not going to do a super in-depth analysis of it. If you're interested in that kind of stuff, check me out in the virtual studio on Patreon. You can find the link below. We'll actually do a full tune breakdown of how to practice one. The one this week is actually pretty in-depth. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about this, check out that link. We're just going to look very quickly at the A sections to understand what's going on in the harmony so we can know where to apply these two different sounds. Our A sections of the tune look like this. Pretty straightforward, really diatonic chords. If we look at this with some Roman numerals, basically the first 4 bars, we just alternate back and forth between some 2-5-1s, never actually getting to 1 until we get to the 5th bar. Now, the second phrase will have a little bit of variation depending on which recording you listen to, that sort of stuff. People just play it differently depending on who the player is. This is the way that I've always played it and the way sort of I learned it, where we have an F7 chord, so it goes to 1, but it's a dominant 1 in bar 5, and then we go to the 4 chord, to the sharp 4 diminished, that's a really classic little movement, and then we basically go back to 1. And that's the tune. There's really not a whole lot to it. There is a bridge, but we're not going to delve into that today here on YouTube. So, since our basically entire A sections are mostly really like an F major key center, we can apply these blues ideas pretty freely, especially if you lean on ideas that come from that major blues scale. Because it has a little bit of a more major tonality, we have the major third in there. We don't have the flatted 7. We don't have that E flat in there. That can really lead us to sounds that connect more with major tonality, but because we have an A flat in there, because some other melodic shapes that are sort of embedded in this scale, we can still find some really, really useful blues sounds. Now, you're going to have to be a little selective about what notes you land on and sustain, particularly on those 2 5s. If you just hold F naturals to the entire C7 chord, it can sometimes sound a little bit dissonant or unresolved. But if you're doing this in a melodic way and being a little selective about where you resolve, it can be really effective. And you might just think about that one sound, that one scale through the entire A section. Now, I did deviate in just a couple of places to hit the changes just a little bit better, so don't feel like you got to be just absolutely glued to this sound, but it works really well almost anywhere where you have a 2-5-1. So if you're trying to get some blues sounds in your playing on standards, when there's a 2-5-1, particularly ones that actually resolve back to the one of the key, so the ones that actually sort of function in their most typical way, applying a little bit of blues ideas that are centered around this scale really is useful. Our second way that we can apply this sound is when we get to the second half of this A section and we go to the 4 chord. To me, whenever a tune goes to the 4 chord, it is just like an invitation to play the blues. For us, since we're thinking in this major blues scale sort of modality, we can look at the commonalities between the notes in the 4 chord and the notes in that scale. So if we look at our 4 chord, we have a B flat, a D, an F, and an A flat. If we think about our scale, and I'll label this on the screen, you can see there's a lot of overlap. The F, which is in the scale, is in there. The A flat, which is in the scale, is in there. The D, which is in the scale, is in there. And then all the other notes are diatonic to B flat with the exception of A naturals. So when you're using this sort of sound, this scale to build ideas, when you get to the 4 chord, you can keep just using a lot of the similar ideas, just avoid the A natural. Another great way to organize ideas on this particular scale, and is very effective in this certain instance where we have the 4 chord, is to think about the top half of the scale, maybe from the C ascending upward to the A flat, this chunk. That's where so much of the language of this scale lives, is all the different permutations you can move through that with, different rhythms, different ways of alternating between notes. That's where a lot of the ideas live. So if you're having a hard time finding ideas here, start actually with that chunk where you start midway through the scale and extend up a little bit above the top note of the scale. If we hear this in application, even if I'm playing some sort of more change playing oriented type of things, some bebop type of things through the rest of these A sections, once I get to that 4 chord, if I just put a little bit of blues in there, I really think it makes everything else sort of pop a little bit more. All right, there's our major blues scale. What about our regular blues scale? I haven't forgotten about that one, where I really like to think about that fitting the best, especially on standards that are more major tonalities, is thinking that it is a great way to end a phrase. Many of the notes that are in that scale don't necessarily fit strictly into major. There's an E flat in there. In this case of F, there's an A flat. There is a B natural. There's a B flat, which we sometimes think of as a quote-unquote avoid note. I would think of it's like a note that likes to resolve, probably to the A natural. So many of those notes don't strictly fit, but it doesn't matter. If you're thinking about strong melodies, and especially you're thinking about the melody you're creating with this sound resolves to eventual resolution, in our case probably an F, it's all going to be great. Don't feel like you got to reinvent the wheel with these sort of ideas. Just simple, clear, swinging scalar ideas work great. As you heard in that last vocabulary example, the two scales don't have to live independent from each other as well. They can sort of mix and match in a lot of different ways. So again, if we put this in application, I'm just going to play two of the A sections that I already played, one of the more blues-oriented ones, one of the little bit more bebop-oriented ones, and just stick these straight-up blues scale ideas to end off phrases, and it's going to just give things a sense of inevitability in the best way possible. All right, there you have it. Blues ideas on non-blues tunes. There's a million other directions you can go here. Incredibly essential that you invest some listening time. These concepts that we're talking about today, I didn't come up with these. This is just based off of me sort of stealing things from a ton of musicians that have transcribed over the year and sort of noticing they tended to do these things. So you have to invest that listening time to make sure that not only the vocabulary is there, but the inflection, the style, the sound. So before I get out of here, Paper Canaries, B.A.C, check me out, do me a solid, get some of those views up for me. I think the band is a really fun band. Whenever we play live, everybody really enjoys the shows, so check it out. Let me know what you think in the comments, and other than that, I'll see you in the woodshed.